What's up, everyone, and welcome to Next Take podcast where we have discussions on different topics. So, this episode, which is episode 165, we're going to be talking about forensic science, a very interesting topic. So, let's get into that. So, forensic science, often confused with criminalistics, is the application of science principles and methods to support decision making related to rules or law, generally criminal and civil law. During criminal investigation in particular, it is governed by the legal standards of admissible evidence and criminal procedure. It is a broad field utilizing numerous practices such as the analysis of DNA, fingerprints, blood stain patterns, firearms, ballistics, toxicology, and microscopy, and fire debris analysis. Forensic scientists collect, preserve, and analyze evidence during the course of an investigation. While some forensic scientists travel to the scene of the crime to collect the evidence themselves, others occupy a laboratory role, performing analysis on objects brought to them by other individuals. Others are involved in analysis of financial, banking, or other numerical data for use in financial crime investigation and can be employed as consultants from private firms, academia, or as government employees. So, the ancient world lacked standardized forensic practices, which enabled criminals to escape punishment. Criminal investigations and trials relied heavily on forced confessions, not much has changed, and witness testimony. However, ancient sources do contain several accounts of techniques that foreshadow concepts in forensic science developed centuries later. The first written account of using medicine and entomology to solve criminal cases is attributed to the book of Zi Yan Lu, translated as Washing Away of Wrongs, written in China in 1248 by Song Si, who lived from 1186 to 1249, a director of justice, jail, and supervision during the Song dynasty. Song Si introduced regulations concerning autopsy reports to court, how to protect the evidence in the examining process, and explain why forensic workers must demonstrate impartiality to the public. He devised methods of making antiseptic and for promoting the reappearance of hidden injuries to dead bodies and bones, using sunlight and vinegar under a red oil umbrella, for calculating the time of death, allowing for weather and insect activity, described how to wash and examine the dead body to ascertain the reason for death. At that time, the book had described methods for distinguishing between suicide and fake suicide. He wrote the book on forensics, stating that all wounds or dead bodies should be examined, not avoided. The book became the first form of literature to help determine the cause of death. In one of Song Si's accounts, Washing Away of Wrongs, the case of a person murdered with a sickle was solved by an investigator who instructed each suspect to bring his sickle to one location. He realized it was a sickle by testing various blades on an animal carcass and comparing the wounds, kind of like what we see today. Flies attracted by the smell of blood eventually gathered on a single sickle. In light of this, the owner of that sickle confessed to the murder. The book also described how to distinguish between a drowning, so water in the lungs, and strangulation, broken neck cartilage, and described evidence from examining corpses to determine if a death was caused by murder, suicide, or an accident. Methods around the world involved saliva and examination of the mouth and tongue to determine innocence or guilt as a precursor to the polygraph test. I mean, Anyways, in ancient India, some suspects were made to fill their mouths with dried rice and spit it back out. Similarly, in ancient China, those accused of a crime would have rice powder placed in their mouths. In ancient Middle Eastern cultures, the accused were made to lick hot metal rods briefly. It is thought that these tests had some vid- vid- fidelity, fidelity, that's what it is, since the guilty person would produce less saliva and thus have a drier mouth. The accused would be considered guilty of if rice was sticking to their mouths in abundance, or if their tongues were severely burned due to lack of shielding from saliva. Very interesting. So, in 16th century Europe, medical practitioners in army and university settings began to gather information on the cause and manner of death. Ambroise Parry, who was a French army surgeon, systematically studied the effects of violent death on internal organs. Two Italian surgeons, Fortunato Fidelis and Paolo Zacchia, laid the foundation of modern pathology by studying changes that occurred in the structure of the body as the result of disease. In the late 18th century, writings on these topics began to appear. This included a treatise on forensic medicine and public health by the French physician Francois Emmanuel Fodari, and the complete system of police medicine by the German medical expert Johann Peter Frank. As the rational values of the Enlightenment era increasingly permeated society in the 18th century, criminal investigation became a more evidence-based rationale procedure. The use of torture to force confessions was curtailed, and belief in witchcraft and other powers of the occult largely ceased to influence the court's decisions. Nice to know that that finally happened 100 years after it mattered, but that is okay. Two examples of English forensic science in individual legal proceedings demonstrate the increasing use of logic and procedure in criminal investigations at the time. In 1784, in Lancaster, John Toms was tried and convicted for murdering Edward Coleshaw with a pistol. When the dead body of Coleshaw was examined, a pistol wad, crushed paper used to secure powder and balls in the muzzle, found in his head wound matched perfectly with the torn newspaper found in Tom's pocket, leading to the conviction. In Warwick, 1816, a farm laborer was tried and convicted of the murder of a young maidservant. She had been drowned in a shallow pool and bore the marks of violent assault. The police found footprints and an impression from corduroy cloth with the sewn patch in the damp earth near the pool. There were also scattered grains of wheat and chaff. The breeches of a farm laborer who had been threshing wheat nearby were examined and corresponded exactly to the impression in the earth near the pool. An article appearing in Scientific American in 1885 describes the use of microscopy to distinguish between the blood of two persons in a criminal case in Chicago. Chromatography. So, chromatography is a common technique used in the field of forensic science. Chromatography is a method of separating the components of a mixture from a mobile phase. Chromatography is an essential tool used in forensic science, helping analysts identify and compare trace amounts of samples, including ignitable liquids, drugs, and biological samples. Many laboratories utilize gas chromatography or mass spectrometry to examine these kinds of samples. This analysis provides rapid and reliant data to identify samples in question. Toxicology, a method for detecting arsenious oxide, simple arsenic, in corpses was devised in 1773 by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele. His work was expanded upon in 1806 by German chemist Valentin Ross, who learned to detect the poison in the walls of a victim's stomach. Toxicology, a subfield of forensic chemistry, focuses on detecting and identifying drugs, poisons, and other toxic substances in biological samples. Forensic toxicologists work on cases involving drug overdoses, poisoning, and substance abuse. The work is critical in determining whether harmful substances play a role in a person's death or impairment. James Marsh was the first to apply this new science to the art of forensics. He was called by the prosecution in a murder trial to give evidence on as a chemist in 1832. The defendant, John Bodle, was accused of poisoning his grandfather with arsenic-laced coffee. Marsh performed the standard test by mixing a suspected sample with hydrogen sulfide and hydrochloric acid. While he was able to detect arsenic as yellow arsenic trisulfide, there we go. When it was shown to the jury, it had deteriorated, allowing the suspect to be acquitted due to reasonable doubt. Lord damn it. Annoyed by that, Marsh developed a much better test. He combined a sample containing arsenic with sulfuric acid and arsenic-free zinc, resulting in arsine gas. The gas was ignited and it decomposed to pure metallic arsenic, which when passed to a cold surface would appear as a silvery black deposit. So sensitive was this test, known formally as the Marsh test. It could detect as little as 1/50th of a milligram of arsenic. He first described this test in the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal in 1836. So ballistics and firearms. So ballistics is the science of the motion of projectiles in flight. In forensic science, analysis to examine the patterns left on bullets and cartridge casings after being ejected from a weapon. When fired, a bullet is left with indentations and markings that are unique to the barrel and firing pin of the firearm that ejected the bullet. The examination can help scientists identify possible makes and models of weapons connected to a crime. Henry Goddard at Scotland Yard pioneered the use of bullet comparison in 1835. He noticed a flaw in the bullet that killed the victim and was able to trace this back to the mold that was used in the manufacturing process. So that's basically that. And the we're gonna try this again. Anthropometry. I think that's how you say it. The French police officer Alphonse Tallien was the first to apply the anthropological technique of anthropometry to law enforcement, thereby creating an identification system based on physical measurements. Before that time, criminals could be identified only by name or photograph. Dissatisfied with the ad hoc methods used to identify captured criminals in France in the 1870s, he began his work on developing a reliable system of anthropometrics for human classification. Bertillon created many other forensics techniques, including forensic document examination, the use of galvanoplastic compounds to preserve footprints, ballistics, and the dynamometer, used to determine the degree of force used in breaking and entering. Interesting. Although his central methods were soon to be supplanted by fingerprinting, his other contributions like the mugshot and the systemization of crime scene photography remain in place to this day. So with that being said, let's move on to fingerprints. Sir William Herschel was one of the first to advocate the use of fingerprinting in the identification of criminal suspects. While working for the Indian Civil Service, he began to use thumbprints on documents as a security measure to prevent the then rampant repudiation of signatures in 1858. In 1877, at Hogley near Kolkata, Herschel instituted the use of fingerprints on contracts and deeds and he registered government pensioners' fingerprints to prevent the collection of money by relatives after a pensioner's death. In 1880, Henry Faulds, a Scottish surgeon in a Tokyo hospital, published his first paper on the subject in the scientific journal Nature, discussing the usefulness of fingerprints for identification and proposing a method to record them with printing ink. He established their first classification and was also the first to identify fingerprints left on a vial. Returning to the UK in 1886, he offered the concept to the Metropolitan Police in London, but it was dismissed at that time. Falls wrote to Charles Darwin with a description of his method, but too old and ill to work on it, Darwin gave the information to his cousin Francis Galton, who was interested in anthropology. Having been thus inspired to study fingerprints for 10 years, Galton published a detailed statistical model of fingerprint analysis and identification and encouraged its use in forensic science in his book, Fingerprints. He had calculated that the chance of a false positive, so two different individuals having the same fingerprints, was about 1 in 64 billion. So unlikely. Juan Vucetich, who was an Argentine chief police officer, created the first method of recording the fingerprints of individuals on file. In 1892, after studying Galton's pattern types, Vucetich set up the world's first fingerprint bureau. And that same year, Francisca Rojas of Necochea was found in a house with neck injuries whilst her two sons were found dead with their throats cut. The fuck? Rojas accused the neighbor, but despite brutal interrogation, this neighbor would not confess to the crimes. Inspector Alvarez, a colleague of Vutech, went to the scene and found a bloody thumb mark on a door. When it was compared with Rojas's prints, it was found to be identical with her right thumb. She then confessed to the murder of her sons. Yikes. A fingerprint bureau was established in Calcutta, in India in 1897, after the Council of the Governor General approved a committee report that fingerprints should be used for the classification of criminal records. Working in the Calcutta Anthrop- Anthropometric Bureau, before it became the Fingerprint Bureau, were Azizul Hawke and Hem Chandra Bose. Hawke and Bose were Indian fingerprint experts who have been credited with the primary development of a fingerprint classification system, eventually named after their supervisor, Sir Edward Richard Henry. The Henry classification system, co-devised by Hawke and Bose, was accepted in England and Wales when the first United Kingdom Fingerprint Bureau was founded in Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, London, in 1901. Sir Edward Richard Henry subsequently achieved improvements in, I think it's dactyloscopy. In the United States, Henry P. DeForest used fingerprinting in the New York Civil Service in 1902, and by December 1905, New York City Police Department Deputy Commissioner Joseph A. Farrat, an expert in the Bertillon system and a fingerprint advocate at police headquarters, introduced the fingerprinting of criminals to the United States. So the Yu-Len-Huth test, I think I said that right, probably not. The Yu-Len-Huth test, or the antigen antibody perceptin test for species, was invented by Paul Yu-Len-Huth in 1901 and could distinguish human blood from animal blood based on the discovery that the blood of different species had one or more characteristic proteins. The test represented a major breakthrough and came to have tremendous importance in forensic science. The test was further refined for forensic use by the Swiss chemist Maurice Müller in the year 1960. So, next one. One I think is understandable. DNA. So, forensic DNA analysis was first used in 1884. It was developed by Sir Alec Jeffreys, who realized that variation in the genetic sequence could be used to identify individuals and to tell individuals apart from one another. The first application of DNA profiles was used by Jeffreys in a double murder mystery in the small English town of Narborough, Leicestershire, or Shire, whatever. Sorry, guys. In 1985, a 15-year-old schoolgirl by the name of Linda Mann was raped and murdered in Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital. The police did not find a suspect, but were able to obtain a semen sample. In 1986, Don Ashworth, who was also 15 years old, was also raped and strangled in the nearby village of Enderby. Forensic evidence showed that both killers had the same blood type. Richard Buckland became the suspect because he worked at Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital, had been spotted near Don Ashworth's murder scene, and knew unreleased details about the body. He later confessed to Don's murder, but not Linda's. Jeffries was brought into the case to analyze the semen samples. He concluded that there was no match between the samples and Buckland, who became the first person to be exonerated using DNA. Jeffries confirmed that the DNA profiles were identical for the two murder semen samples. To find the perpetrator, DNA samples from the entire male population, more than 4,000, aged from 17 to 34, of the town were collected. They all were compared to semen samples from the crime. A friend of Colin Pitchfork was heard saying that he had given his sample to the police, claiming to be Colin. Colin Pitchfork was arrested in 1987, and it was found that his DNA profile matched the semen samples from the murder. Because of this case, DNA databases were developed. There is the national, FBI, and international databases, as well as the European countries, ENFSI, European Network of Forensic Science Institutes. These searchable databases are often to match crime scene DNA profiles to those already in the database. So later in the 20th century, several British pathologists, Mickey Rochman, Francis Camps, Sidney Smith, and Keith Simpson, pioneered new forensic science methods. Alec Jeffreys pioneered the use of DNA profiling in forensic science in 1984. He realized the scope of DNA fingerprinting, which uses variations in the genetic code to identify individuals. The method has since become important to forensic science to assist police detective work, and it has also proved useful in resolving paternity and immigration disputes. DNA fingerprinting was first used as a police forensic test to identify the rapist and killer of two teenagers, Linda Mann and Don Ashworth, as who we just talked about, were both murdered in Narborough, Leicestershire in 1983 and 1986, respectively. Colin Pitchfork was identified and convicted of murder after samples taken from him matched semen samples taken from the two girls, even though he only wanted to confess to one of them, but I digress. In the past decade, documenting forensic science as the forensic scenes has become more efficient. Forensic scientists have started using laser scanners, drones, and photogrammetry to obtain 3D point clouds of accidents or crime scenes. Reconstruction of an accident scene on a highway using drones involves data acquisition, time of only 10 to 20 minutes, and can be performed without shutting down traffic. The results are not just accurate in centimeters for measurement to be presented in court, but also easy to digitally preserve in the long term. Now in the 21st century, much of forensic science's future is up for discussion. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has several forensic science-related programs. CSAFE, NIST Center of Excellence in Forensic Science. The National Commission on Forensic Science now concluded an administration of the Organization of Scientific Area Committees for Forensic Science, OSAC. One of the more recent additions by NIST is a document called NIST Tier 7941 titled Forensic Science Laboratories Handbook for Facility Planning, Design, Construction, and Relocation. The handbook provides a clear blueprint for approaching forensic science. The details even include what type of staff should be hired for certain positions. Some forensic techniques believed to be scientifically sound at the time they were used have now turned out later to have much less scientific merit or maybe none at all. Some such techniques include, and here we go, comparative bullet lead analysis was used by the FBI for over 4 decades, starting with John F. Kennedy assassination in 1963, which we have talked about in a previous episode actually last year, if you want to take a look at that. The theory was that each batch of ammunition possessed a chemical makeup so distinct that a bullet could be traced back to the particular batch or even a box. Internal studies and an outside study by the National Academy of Sciences found that the technique was unreliable due to improper interpretation, and the FBI abandoned the test in 2005. Forensic dentistry has come under fire. In at least 3 cases, biomarker evidence has been used to convict people of murder who were later freed by DNA evidence. Ted Bundy. However, he was not freed. Not even close. In 1999, a study for a member of the American Board of Forensic Ontology found a 63% rate of false identifications and is commonly referenced within online news, stories, and conspiracy websites. The study was based on an informal workshop during an ABFO meeting, which many members did not consider a valid scientific setting. The theory is that each person has a unique and distinctive set of teeth, which leave a pattern after biting someone. They analyze the dental characteristics such as size, shape, and arch form. Police access to genetic genealogy databases. There are privacy concerns with the police being able to access personal genetic data that is on genealogy services. Individuals can become criminal informants to their own families or to themselves simply by participating in the genetic genealogy databases. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, is a database that the FBI uses to hold genetic profiles of all known felons, misdemeanants, and arrestees. Some people argue that individuals who are using genealogy databases should have an expectation of privacy in their data that is or may be violated by genetic searches by law enforcement. These different services have warning signs about potential third parties using their information, but most individuals do not read the agreement thoroughly. According to a study by Chrissy Guerini, Jill Robinson, Devin Peterson, and Amy McGuire, they found that the majority of the people who took the survey support police searches of genetic websites that identify genetic relatives. Same here. People who responded to the survey are more supportive of police activities using genetic genealogy when it is for the purpose of identifying offenders of violent crimes, suspects of crimes against children, 100%, or missing people. The data from the surveys that were given show that individuals are not concerned about police searches using personal genetic data if it is justified. It was found that in the study that offenders are disproportionately low income and Black, and the average person of genetic testing is wealthy and white, because hell no, I can afford that. The results from the study had different results. In 2016, there was a survey called there was a survey called the National Crime Victimization Survey that was provided by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. In that survey, it was found that 1.3% of people aged 12 or older were victims of violent crimes, and 8.85% of households were victims of property crimes. There were some issues with this survey, though. The NCVS produces only the annual estimates of victimization. The study that Christy Guarini, Jill Robinson, Devin Peterson, and Amy McGuire produced asked the participants about the incidence of victimization over one's lifetime. Their survey also did not restrict other family members to one household. Around 25% of people who responded to the survey said that they have had family members that have been employed by law enforcement, which includes security guards and bailiffs. Throughout these surveys, it has been found that there is a public support for law enforcement to access genetic genealogy databases. But that is basically it, and that is it for this episode. But yeah, I mean, I want to just quickly go into the genealogy aspect of it. Take the information. If I did it, if I have not, take my information. Find out if someone has actually committed a crime that I am a family with. Do it, please. Yeah. But that is it for this episode 165 of the Next Day Podcast. Next Day Podcast can be found on any of your favorite podcast apps. We also have our website, which is solo.to/Next Take Podcast. We are also on Facebook and Instagram at Next Take Podcast, and Twitter, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Next Take Pod. We also have our email, which is mikeltanyka@gmail.com. But that is basically that. Also, don't forget to follow, subscribe to the podcast on any of your favorite podcast apps so you don't miss a single episode. And you can also rate us on either Apple or Spotify. We would greatly appreciate that. And tell your friends and your family and your coworkers and whoever about this podcast so that they can also take a listen to us. But that is it for this. We will see you next week with a new episode. Bye, everybody.